The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. I'm one of your co-hosts, James Floyd. I am a freelance writer for Star Wars Insider magazine and the author of Star Wars crossword puzzles and other word games from a galaxy far, far away.
Woohoo! And I'm your other co-host, Melissa Miller. I am a freelance science writer and have written for Star Wars Insider magazine. On this episode, Star Warsologies is going to chat about lasers, lightsabers, and other Star Wars technology. Our guest expert today is Dr. Karen Yu, a science mercenary who's a technical lead and project manager at a scientific consultancy and has a PhD in lasers and optics. Welcome, Karen.
Thanks for having me.
Karen was one of our panelists on the Science of Return of the Jedi panel at Celebration in London. So it is good to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to reconnect. Really excited to get started talking about lasers some more, or not lasers, as we might come to.
Well, first, I definitely need to know what a science mercenary is and how to become one.
Yeah, so I work at a science and technology consultancy. Most people think of McKinsey when they think of consultancies and a lot of project management style business cases. But for us, we actually solve science and technical problems that companies might have. It could be because they don't have the bandwidth to do it, or they don't have the expertise, or a combination of. To give you a very broad example, most of the stuff I can't talk about, but it could be a company that's been making toasters for a long time. And now they decided they want to make a new smart toaster. And they might come to us and we ask, how do you do it? And we look into the science and technology of what do people actually want in toast? What makes great toast? And apply technology to making the toast and to give them prototypes to develop it and make your next generation toaster. That's being very broad. We also do a lot of medical work as well. But yeah, that's the crux of it.
Wow. Now I'm imagining Taki the toaster from Red Dwarf.
Dude, no kidding. My cousin has a smart toaster and I laughed at it at first, but man, if it didn't like perfectly toast my bagel. So, I got into it.
All right. Your background is in lasers and optics. So do we want to talk about lightsabers?
Straight into it. I love it.
I mean, I think that is the question that pretty much everyone who loves Star Wars wants to know, right? How do we make lightsabers? I'll say one of the best things about getting into science and engineering fields and doing grad studies in that is it inevitably comes up in many coffee breaks, and we have many discussions about it. But this is the first bit where I'm going to, disappoint a little because likely not lasers. Everyone think of lightsabers as lasers, and I think we discussed this on the panel as well, but it's much more likely that it's contained plasma, and they're using magnetic fields to contain the plasma. Light, as you know, it's very hard to have it just stop unless there's something physically there to stop it. That, along with the fact that you see these lightsabers cut through all the steel, it actually makes a lot more sense when you think about it as plasma that's contained within these magnetic fields. It would explain why when you duel with two lightsabers, they actually would stop against each other. I think in the lore, they sometimes stick a little bit, and it could be that depending on the magnetic field alignment, they could stick in certain situations, but overall, they wouldn't go through each other. It would also explain why we have certain materials that the lightsabers can't get through, right? These could be naturally or manufactured to be magnetic. We combine that with a high melting point and heat capacity, for example, and maybe it'll be able to hold its own for a little bit.
There's so much there. I made so many notes. I was like, oh, this is so great. Yeah, I've never even thought about the fact that if they were lasers, they would pass through each other and not bonk into each other. Duh. Maybe really quickly, can you define what a laser is and what plasma is?
Sure. So laser stands for light amplification from stimulated emission of radiation. It is essentially light that's traveling together and in a straight line. You turn on your flashlight, for example, and the light disperses. It goes in all directions. You can have it semi in a beam, but most of it is going out and about. But lasers are generally collimated. They have what we call spatial coherence. And so they stay together in a straight line for a long time, which is why they use lasers to do studies and shoot them out into space. And you can use them to send signals very long distance because they can keep their spatial coherence for a very, very, very long distances. Plasma is generally ionized gas. So it's your atoms that have been ionized. Fire is a plasma, for example. So very, very different kind of things. But plasma is generally what they have inside of nuclear fusion reactor. We don't have nuclear fusion reactors, but the research that's going into nuclear fusion reactors, they're generating very hot, very intense plasmas that are, again, held by magnetic fields because of the heats that they generate. If they interacted with the actual surface of the metals, it would actually cause decent amount of damage. And they need those intense heats and energies to get to the point where they can potentially initiate fusion.
Okay.
And that's also like the sun is plasma, essentially, right?
Yeah, it is a giant ball of plasma.
Yeah, because I feel like I heard about it recently where it's sort of like the fourth state of matter. At least, when I was learning,
it is. Yeah.
It's like, gas, liquid, solid. Now kids are learning this fourth one, the plasma, that always existed but wasn't quite delineated or something, maybe.
Yeah,
well,
I think
we couldn't figure it out. We couldn't get the temperatures that high.
Or they were just like, you're a bio major, you don't need to know.
I think it's also just been a term that's been used in science fiction to sound cool a lot of the time. And that's how people think about it. But yeah, it has been around for a long time. But yeah, definitely a fourth state of matter.
Okay.
So there is one aspect of lightsabers that I do want to discuss a little bit, perhaps a little off topic, but it's been troubling and puzzling me for a little bit. So again, at the Return of the Jedi discussion we had, I think Carson did some maths and suggested that the power output from a lightsaber is up to 192 megawatts, which is quite a lot. The average nuclear reactor will output a gigawatt, so 20% of a nuclear reactor. But we can also do some more maths around that because I'm interested in the radiative heat that's actually coming off of a lightsaber. Right? So the melting temperature of steel can vary depending on the grade of steel, but it could be as high as 1800 Kelvin, so about 2700 Fahrenheit, 2780 Fahrenheit. So let's assume that the lightsaber plasma that we have is at least this hot. We can then do some very rough back of the envelope maths based off of this and look at the radiative heat that this emits. And I estimate that if you hold your hand about 10 centimeters away from a lightsaber, within a second, it would raise the temperature of your hand by over 1,000 degrees Celsius or 1,800 Fahrenheit. So how do Jedis hold their lightsabers?
Right.
I'm thinking, okay, one, it could just be the Force, right? Maybe they're using the Force. There's quite a few moments in Clone Wars where Anakin's holding it quite close to someone to ask them questions. Maybe he's using the Force to repel it away. But then I think of the new film and Finn actually holds a lightsaber.
Right, exactly.
And is able to use it. So I think I only have one conclusion, which is that they have a built-in AC that is really good.
There you go. Yeah. And I was trying to picture when you started, I was like, are Jedi robes like somehow, like those things they put on you at dentists, x-rays, like there's somehow, that's why they wear these robes, is that the robes, keep the radiation away. But I didn't think about heat, if that's where you're going with it.
Yeah.
Those would just burst into flames at that temperature, probably, right?
Well, I'd say that even more than burst into flames, they would just like automatically cinder or...
I think anything nearby would just burn to a crisp, but it must have very, very good cooling on built in.
Would the cooling be on the outside of the magnetic field, or could you have it within the magnetic field? Could you use a magnetic field to trap the heat in?
I don't think you use the magnetic field to trap the heat in. You'd use the magnetic field to contain it so it doesn't go everywhere, and you'd keep the central plasma kind of contained. But that radiative heat would still be coming off and emitting and interacting with the things around it. So, yeah, I have to think through that one a bit more, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I like what you brought up about the magnetic, and that's why some things might be resistant to it. Like, do we know if Beskar is magnetic or has some sort of property? And in that case, could you like imbue some other thing with, could you create armor and somehow make it magnetic to the same degree as Beskar and then repel lightsabers?
Yeah. And I think the other way to do it is, well, I think you probably do need some degree of magnetism just to not have that beam try to pass through you. The other side to that is that if you just have something with very, very high melting points and quite a lot of heat capacity, it would still take time for the material to actually heat up and melt. And you can see that in the films and the series, certain things they can cut through very easily, droids. And then other things like the Federation ship, it takes Qui-Gon a little while, quite a few seconds.
Oh, well, because that door is massive, and so it's probably dissipating the heat
exactly. That's
really
right.
far. And if it's a really thick, like you said, a high melting point metal, then it might take a long time for the rest of it to heat up so that you can finally start melting in that one spot.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Though, again, this is based off of some assumptions about the kind of steel that is in that shot in episode 1. It is the Trade Federation. They could have cheapened out and bought some dodgy steel that's a lot lower melting temperature, in which case the math goes out the door.
Right. Have you watched The Acolyte? I think it also comes up in the Clone Wars too, where there's like a lightsaber whip.
Oh, yeah.
So, like, where does that fit into this whole plasma and, magnetic field discussion? In that case, you could just extend the magnetic field so that it sort of transforms into a whip, right?
You can. I think it still works. It just then comes down to how easy it is to modify your magnetic fields on the spot.
Right.
We have electromagnets now that we can turn on and off. There are limitations to that and limitations to the shape of that field we can create. But, they can travel between the stars. They have much more advanced technologies. At this point, I'll say it becomes an engineering problem rather than a science problem, but you can engineer very specific magnetic fields for you to get that whip-like behavior. We do that to some degree with our MRI machines, right? They do a lot of work to try to get actually a very even and high magnetic field within the center so that they can get the best imaging qualities.
Okay.
Wow. Okay, now that all starts to make sense. It's like, we can shape the magnetic field, and it's like, if we could figure it all out, make not only ones that are just a cylinder shape, but then have ones that can be really distorted and moving. And how much energy would it take to make a magnetic field like that? I guess we can do it because we have MRIs.
Yeah, we can do it. As I said, they do it with fusion research technology, the big tokamaks and similar things. I don't know the number, what it is off the top of my head, I'm afraid. But it's a decent amount, but it's doable.
Well, and you mentioned the lightsabers sometimes like getting tangled or something. And it just made me think of Spaceballs, where they get like fully tangled. Yeah. And I know we're not talking about Spaceballs here, but I was like, are there examples of that in Star Wars that I just can't think of in terms of them interacting with each other?
No, I was thinking more of, I think there's a bit in the lore about how they stick a little bit sometimes, or when you bring them close, they can sometimes feel like they're pulling towards each other.
Oh, okay.
And maybe that's what creates that like extra little flash.
Yeah.
and the sound of them hitting each other.
Right. Yeah, that makes enough sense. When you said it, I immediately thought Spaceballs. I was like, wait, that's not canon. Well, and that could have something to do with the crystal or something to do with the magnetic field, right? Because if magnetic fields are involved, there's going to be some sort of like repulsion and attraction and stuff like that too. So interesting.
Yeah, so I guess you brought up crystals. There is an analogy to lasers. So lasers typically do need a gain medium, right? And the first lasers that were made actually used synthetic rubies. And these gain mediums act as kind of an amplifier. It needs to be pumped with energy, which allows it then to achieve a state called population inversion, which is critical for lasing to occur, for the photons to be going in that same direction and to achieve coherence. The analogy here could be that hypercrystals could be doing something similar. It might either provide a way to amplify the energy that's being produced by something else into either creating the plasma. Maybe it's needed to create that magnetic field that's going in there, or a combination of, and maybe that's why it's that critical component. If that's the crystal in there, that's the gain medium for these lightsabers to be able to create what we see.
Yeah, because we think of lasers having to use crystals because of light, but if there's a way to amplify, like you said, the magnetic field or the plasma, Wow, I think you've just created a whole new branch of physics.
Yeah. Yeah. We definitely, we've joked before about having a like evil villain scientist, sort of panel. And I feel like Karen will definitely need to be part of it because all of these, I mean, we're going to get into super weapons, but like all of these things really scale up, I feel like.
Love it. I would love to do it. I like to think I'm a nice person, but yeah, there's a dark side to me, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
The dark side of scientific curiosity.
Yeah, no, it's just something I always end up wanting to ask. And actually, I should add it to our usual questions, especially when we talk about things like this is what they're doing in the Death Star, because that's also based on Kyber crystals. I don't remember exactly the mechanics of Starkiller Base or what we know about it. But yeah, these things can be scaled up and destroy planets.
Yeah, so I guess, again, the Death Star super laser, I'm going to say it's likely super plasma. As we're saying, if they're using based off the same technology as lightsabers, they're using the kyber crystals, then they're potentially giant plasma beams as well that's being fired through.
Wow, it's a giant lightsaber, essentially.
Potentially, yeah. And again, with the magnetic fields, it could explain quite a few things about why, again, they stop at a point rather than just continuing on through each other, because the Death Star has those conversion beams and then the one in the center that goes through. But if it's the magnetic fields that's holding it in place and then the center beam pushes it all through because it needs to charge up that energy, I guess it makes a bit more sense.
Wow, that's really cool. You found a way to explain why all the beams come together and then shoot forward.
Because it looks cool, James.
I know it looks cool, but now there's a way we could do it with the magnetic fields. So that everything comes down to the magnetic fields here.
Yeah, everything to do with magnets. I'm a little scared. You're not going to ask me back. You're going to ask for my friend, the magnetics expert.
Yeah, it does sound like we need to find one of those at some point. Really get to the heart of all of this.
Not to keep hammering on the magnetics, but could that explain? Because, when you use a lightsaber, it just punches a hole through, essentially. But when you hit the planet, it blows it up. So do you think that's like the planet itself getting so hot that it has to blow up? Or is that maybe more magnetic fields that cause the magnetic core of the planet to rip apart and blow up the planet?
That's a really good point. I think it could be a combination of, I guess I've always thought of it as just a lot of energy transfer, enough so that you make everything explode out. But yeah, you're right. It could just be that the magnetic field is so strong and it is in repulsion with the natural magnetic fields and interacting in such a way that it's causing the planet to rip itself apart.
I'd have to watch Rogue One again, which I'm never sorry to do, but I feel like there's some just quick explanation about, right? Because they have like set power settings, right? Where they can just blow up a little bit of the planet or they can blow up the whole planet. I feel like there's some little bit of technobabble there that I'll have to go and reference. Not that it checks out necessarily, but I remember that being sort of a new piece of information we got.
Yeah, so I'll bring it back to lasers a little bit. Well, I wonder if there is a similar effect to what you have with ultra-fast lasers. Now, ultra-fast lasers are these lasers that have very, very short pulse durations. And that allows you to do some really interesting physics and see some very interesting effects. It takes the same amount of power. If you look at the average power, it could be in the watts region, so nothing super high, but it crams it all. So all the energy averaged over a second, for example, crams it all into a nanosecond or a femtosecond. And that lets you create a really, really intense beam of light for a very short time. The analogy I like to use is imagine you're walking down the street for an hour and it's just drizzling a little bit. You're damp and feel uncomfortable, but it's not too bad. Now, if all of that rain that fell on you in the hour fell on you within a second, you'd be quite soaked right away. And that's what ultrafast lasers do. We think of lasers as cutting into materials by melting them and ablating the material. But what can happen with an ultrafast laser is that the intensity is so strong, it actually rips the electrons out of the orbitals of the material, and it leaves behind essentially just the positive charged atoms, which don't want to be next to each other anymore. And so they just fly away from each other. So you get something called cold ablation. And so you can drill these holes that have no thermal effects, actually, because it is just the atoms don't want to be next to each other anymore, and they're just flying away.
Where do they go?
Yeah.
I guess they just get launched into the atmosphere. But to compare that to a Death Star, with a femtosecond laser, we're creating maybe micron-sized holes, nothing close to the scale of destroying Jeddah.
The idea that, yeah, you could use a laser, and yeah, we all think of it as just like heating something up as it cuts, but that you're just basically ripping molecules apart and they kind of explode out. If all the positive charge things, all the protons essentially would just decide, I can't be here anymore. I got to shoot out in some direction. And then that cuts the hole, and you're cutting at essentially a subatomic level because you're cutting the electrons off.
You can think about it that way. Typically, the holes have to be a bit bigger because we're still guided by how big our beam ultimately has to be. And focusing it down to a spot that is that big, that is one atom big, for example, is quite difficult.
That's true. I guess just around the edge of the hole is where they're getting ripped apart. That is crazy.
Yeah, I use a laser cutter at work sometimes and had to go through the whole, safety protocol. And if you open the door to it, obviously the laser shuts off immediately and all that stuff. And I have to say, like, seeing it work and then coming home and playing with like a laser pointer with my cats, I'm always like, is this safe? Like, I understand that there's like a spectrum here or whatever, but it still seems funny to me that these are the same thing and we use them for such different topics. James is just laughing at me now.
I'm just imagining you cutting very micron-sized holes in your wall and the floor, and sometimes through your cat's paws.
Exactly. No, sometimes when I like let it linger on their paw too long, I'm like, am I hurting them? But that's just something that as a non-laser expert, I understand that they wouldn't give me a laser cutting laser to play with my cats.
Yeah.
But
as a fellow cat owner and a laser safety officer, I completely approve of using laser pointers with cats.
I'm assuming the regular way, like the laser in a compact disc player works, is not this ultra-fast method. It's just like a steady laser that's just bouncing back the digital information. Just basically the size of the groove on the CD.
It's basically the size of the groove and the wavelength of light that you're using, which determines how small a groove it can read, which is why Blu-rays can contain so much more information than your traditional CDs. The blue wavelength is a lot shorter, so it can interact with smaller grooves. And so we can fit just way more information onto a Blu-ray disc.
That's cool. I never actually knew or bothered to look up what the difference was. Yay, learning something.
Does that mean that you could use even like ultraviolet, make lasers that are ultraviolet? Like it's not light anymore, but could you do that?
You can. Yeah, you can go down in wavelengths. And I think then the difficulty is in creating those specific wavelengths. We can get down to ultraviolet beams. I think you can get down to X-ray lasers, but it's just varying degrees of complexity in getting the right gain medium and getting the powers that you need for it to do certain things and just general cost.
I don't want to cut us off if we're not done talking about lightsabers and super weapons, but I do want to know about Pew Pew, what you can tell us about why blaster weapons, it's just so iconic. The first time when James was like, oh, we're talking about lasers, I was like, okay, but why do they make a pew pew noise? Do you have any thoughtful scientific explanation?
Yeah, so at first, I thought they actually sound very similar to railguns. So I think you can actually find a YouTube video of a railgun firing, and there's actually very similar sounds. But the sound from a railgun is actually due to the shock wave and air compression that you get from the projectile that's going so fast, right? And I have to say, blaster bolts, I don't think go very fast. We see them travel in the films, the TV series and stuff, and I think as bullets go, they're pretty slow. So I don't think it's that. The only thing I can think of then is that if, again, we've established that maybe it's plasma, maybe there's magnetic fields involved, you could have magnetics or electromagnetics within the blaster that are being charged and discharged during operation. And this could then lead to some high frequency vibrations during the discharge or charging procedure that give you your sound. It's the best I've got.
I like it.
Well, now it made me think like the obvious thing would be a big bang sound would be like a sonic boom, essentially, or something, even faster. But when you think about it, yes, these blaster bolts are moving pretty slow. Are they traveling faster than sound? I'm guessing yes. I don't honestly know how fast bullets travel.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about it some more, and everyone's always impressed by Jedi being able to deflect blaster bolts, but you can actually see them coming from quite a long way away. And
yeah. No, it's true. It's funny. It sort of takes away from that a little bit. Like set them up next to like, a regular gun and then I'll be impressed sort of thing. Now, when I was thinking about sort of the charging sound, and that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm trying to remember now, James, I'm sure you'll remember. Does the stun setting sound different? Like the one they use on Princess Leia, isn't there like a different sound?
Yeah, that blue ring.
Right.
Yeah, I can't think of the sound right now, but yes.
I think it's a bit more of a warble.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and I guess maybe they have to, turn down the energy levels quite a bit. Maybe they don't have to charge up those electric fields quite as high as they used to. They don't want to burn them to death. They just want to knock them out a little.
Huh. Yeah. And maybe that's why it forms, rather than a beam shooting forward, it makes that blue ring that expands out, is because it's dissipating the energy rather than a straight line where, it would punch a hole in them. It's just making a force field kind of thing that will just knock them out, and hopefully it knocks them unconscious or something.
Right. Yeah. And then I feel like that would depend on their distance away from you too, right? Maybe it calibrates first and then figures it out or something. There's like an aiming motion first. I don't know.
That could be the laser. They could have a laser rangefinder inside that sees where you're trying to shoot.
Right, exactly. It's like, okay, we need to send it out at this energy level or whatever. Because if you stun someone at point blank, right, do you kill them?
I mean, now like going super crazy with it in the Clone Wars, you see Ahsoka using a lightsaber to deflect those stun rings.
I don't think you do. I think they don't bounce back.
Okay. We're all going to have to look.
Over Christmas, I decided to watch Star Wars from chronological order, beginning to end. Was thinking it wouldn't take too long, but still haven't.
I'm impressed you're done. Yeah, I was about to say, it's been a month. I don't think you'd be done.
No. I think it's going to take us till next Christmas at this rate. But I think in the Clone Wars, when she deflects the stun bolts, it kind of just dissipates, right?
I think so.
Okay.
Maybe it's weak enough that it just disrupts that magnetic field and cause any of the energy left in there to just go all over the place.
Cool.
Since we're looking, at all things magnetic, do you think that's also behind repulsor lift vehicles? Some sort of electromagnetism, magnetic fields, or could it be something else?
I think with repulsor vehicles, we actually have something else that might be happening here. Well, it could still be magnets, but I'd like to think that it could be the fact that they can manipulate gravity in ways that we can't. I mean, the other thing we notice is that on all their ships, they seem to be walking around fine. They're not floating around into space. So they seem to have some way to generate artificial gravity. So our current understanding of physics suggests that there's a particle called a graviton that is the carrier for gravitational waves. We haven't been able to detect single gravitons. This is very, very difficult with today's technology. I think if you had a detector with the mass of Jupiter next to a neutron star and operating at 100% efficiency, we get a signal once every 10 years. And it would probably be indistinguishable from background neutrinos that are coming off of the star as well. But what we do have are these giant laser interferometers built to detect gravitational fields. LIGO is one of the famous ones in the US. So it's the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. There's one in Louisiana, one in Washington State. Each of these facilities are kind of L-shaped. They have these two arms that are 4 kilometers long where you fire the laser down. And because it's so long, you can then get the sensitivity that you need to detect the gravitational waves. And the two facilities actually are where they are, because that allows them to triangulate the signal far enough apart that they would expect something like a 20 millisecond delay potentially between the signal from one facility to the other. And that actually allows them to figure out where that gravitational wave came from. And I think in 2016, they reported the detection of gravitational waves, which was a really big deal. Back to Star Wars.
Gonna say is like we've detected gravitational waves. That's like the first step to like a lot of Star Trek stuff is like, well, no, we have a gravitational waves are pulling us this way, or we did a sensor sweep, but now we have to switch from tachyons to gravitons. And
so we are getting close. I'm holding out hope that we're going to have a Federation future.
That'd be nice.
Me-
Well,
me
first we
too.
have to have, yeah, I would say first we have to, in whatever it is, 40 years, have a complete societal collapse. So I think we're on our way.
I'm hoping we can skip that bit, but yes.
Yes. Please do.
Too soon?
So, but I guess if we bring it back to Star Wars now, we have two possible things. One, maybe the vehicle is able to generate giant gravitational fields, generate gravitons or interact with gravitons in a way that they can generate these fields that balances out the planet essentially and causes lift. I think this is a bit unlikely because then we'd see other things start being pulled towards these vehicles left, right, and center, and everyone would need to have something to stop this, graviton-proof clothing or whatnot. So I think the more likely thing is that they actually can just manipulate the gravitons themselves. They are advanced, as we know. Like I said, right now, we won't even be able to detect a single graviton, but maybe they can manipulate them. It is the particle that's carrying the force, and if you can deflect that around or reflect it back, and I'm being a bit hand-wavy here, but you could potentially then get something that floats.
Yeah, that makes enough sense to me. And I love the idea that you just push a button or something, that farm vehicles basically, could have this technology.
Well, I'm thinking just like the speeder bikes, like the kids use in Skeleton Crew, do we see them floating even when they're off, or do they like land on the ground the way that the Imperial speeder bikes do on Endor? Oh, wait, well, we see Luke's land speeder when it's off. It's still floating.
And so is the teens or whatever in Book of Boba Fett. They're just hovering even before they hop on them. So they just do it by default, or there's something in the engineering
design.
Of it's not like a button you have to push or whatever.
I think you can actually explain quite a lot of Star Wars with science. The hard bit is to do the engineering behind it to get it to actually work.
Right. Oh, yeah. That's not what our forte is here. We can talk about, speculate. We're not actually trying to make any of this happen. We're just, sitting here in our comfy houses or whatever. Yeah.
Well, now I'm trying to figure out, like, if you do have a repulsor lift, could you be shooting? Because that's like the opposite of artificial gravity. Artificial gravity, you want to pull things towards you. Repulsor lift, you want to push things away.
Reverse the polarity. Come on.
Reverse to the polarity. But how does that work? And could you just use tiny ion engines to just shoot ions down, and that just keeps you pushing up just enough to float? Does that make sense? Could that work?
Yeah, I think that's possible. Again, we're being very speculative here, but if you can manipulate the gravitons away from you, then you could get to a state where you're not feeling any gravitational force from the planet, right? In which case, there's nothing that would actually cause you to go down. If it's something is sitting and floating already, it would just stay floating, presumably, until someone tried to sit on it, for example, and try to apply a force down and pushed it down. Then you do have that external force, but then maybe they have the smart enough technology to say, oh, someone's getting on. I need to rebalance things a little bit. I maybe need to create a negative force to try to push the gravitational field in a way that repulses me. Or as you say, you could have mini ion jets that's firing down below to keep in a specific position.
Well, I'm wondering if you could adjust it so that, most of the ones we see are 6 inches off the ground or whatever. Could you adjust it so that it was higher than that? And then what would happen to anyone who you flew over?
Also a very good question. I would love to know what would happen in a Star Wars car accidents when you're just flying over things. They also have species of varying heights. How do you know you're not going over one of those little guys? Yoda.
Exactly. Yeah, Babu Frick's got to be really careful out on the streets of whatever planet that is. Yeah. Fun questions.
Yeah, you just get pushed down by this wave of gravitons and you're just slammed into the ground. This is why we have lanes of traffic and you got to stop for pedestrians.
Right. Yeah. Well, because they do I think it's an episode of The Mandalorian, right? They take a hovercrafts type vehicle off a cliff and it sort of immediately falls until it's only those few inches from the cliff, and then it sort of clearly grabs on again or whatever. Yeah. So that was the first time I sort of thought about that there must be some acceptable distance where this technology works, and then other times when the planet's real gravity is in charge.
Yeah, and now I'm just thinking you could totally wreck somebody's garden or crops by flying over them. Yeah, because they'd get all pushed down.
Okay, now what about this? Invisible wheels. They're actually wheeled. You just can't see them. Would that be easier technology to create?
Uh,
The way they do it in the movie Magic, right? Which is like mirrors and stuff like that. Right? It's just
yeah.
hidden wheels. You can't see them, but they're there.
Yeah, I mean, in the original episode 4, in the original cut, you can kind of see that bit of yellow that they had to semi-edit out, right? And they did
Right.
just have wheels underneath. Would it be easier to just have invisible wheels? I think it would just be a very different challenge, but also a challenge. What you can have is something called metamaterials. So these are materials with actually a negative index of refraction. And that allows you to do some really weird things with them. Metamaterials are typically man-made. They're very structured, so they have like a pattern, right? So I think of it, there's a picture online that you can see on Wikipedia, which is these tiny squares that in an array, and that's a metamaterial. And as I said, they have a negative index of refraction, which means that you do weird things with the lights that interact with them. They don't necessarily do the traditional absorb, reflect, and transmission properties that you have of other materials. And because of this, you can actually potentially pass and bend the light around it in certain wavelengths. And they did it a few years back with microwaves. They created this metamaterial that actually bent microwaves around it. So in that microwave frequency, they put a cylinder behind the metamaterial. And if you were looking at it in the microwaves, you wouldn't be able to see the cylinder, or you would see maybe a slight distortion where it would be, but essentially you would be seeing what was behind it.
That's a cloaking device.
It is essentially a cloaking device. Yeah, we've only been able to do it targeting very specific wavelengths in the microwaves. I don't know if they developed it any further, but it's a potential engineering problem that in Star Wars, they could have better technology. They can block more. Well, we know they have cloaking devices. Maybe the more common use, instead of running supplies down to the clones, is on vehicles and hiding their wheels, because the fashion style on Coruscant says wheels are bad.
Yeah, I love it.
It's like, we have cloaking technology. What are we going to use it for? Oh, just hiding wheels on things.
Hiding wheels. I like it. It was a very silly question. I appreciate you even thinking about it.
So what's the point of being a scientist if you can't speculate on these things?
Exactly. You understand the premise. Exactly. Well, real quick, are there other topics we want to make sure we cover before we start wrapping up?
Yeah, I guess back to tanks, I was thinking there's a real world analogy there, which is chitosan. So when you have a wound and start bleeding, the platelets in your blood start to come together, plug the wound, which helps form that clot and stop the bleeding. The entire chain involved is quite complex, but chitosan is a sugar that, when introduced, helps promote that process and aids with healing. So, and it can also inhibit microbial growth. And where it's found is actually on the outer shells of shellfish, and it is used in a lot of bandages and the like. So I think my main comment there is that Bacta could be something similar. We were talking about blasters being potentially these plasma bolts, very high temperature, super hot plasma. It will do a lot of damage to you long term. And maybe when you're hit, even if you're hit in a non-critical area, it could be quite severe. And so they need Bacta, which is something that helps promote the healing from these very serious burns, similar to chitosan. And for all we know, it might be Gungan skin excretions or spit.
Yeah.
So basically, you're saying if we get hurt, we should rub clams on ourselves.
Maybe not quite to that level.
Not a medical podcast, remember.
Yeah, just to be clear, I am not a medical doctor when they introduced me as a doctor earlier in the show.
No, and we did talk about it a little on our episode with Medical Doctor. And I like the idea that maybe in the next Star Wars wildlife book, there's going to be a giant shellfish called a Bacta or something. Well, we should start our wrap-up questions, James, unless there's any other things you want to touch on.
Well, I mean, we've talked about Bacta, and so you might need a plasma transfusion to help you from the plasma bolt burn. That's all I got.
There you go.
Only one pun. Whoa.
Yeah.
I know.
It wasn't even a good one. I got to think about this here.
Well, I was wondering, do you come up with them on the spot? But
yeah, no. Karen, all your talk about lasers and stuff, but it really turns out that you have a magnetic personality.
There we go. I like it. I mean, my guess, at least, Karen, is that they're generally unpracticed, because I can tell when he's got one, like something changes about his face where he's like, I won't interrupt, but I'm ready for it. Awesome. Well, it may or may not have to do with lasers, but can you tell us about your favorite Star Wars character?
I'm dreading this one a little bit. I have so many.
Oh, that's
Okay,
okay.
I'll start with, I guess, when I was teenager and mainly reading the books and stuff. By far, my favorite character was Wedge Antilles, the only survivor of two Death Star runs, leader of Rogue Squadron, Wraith Squadron. I read the X-Wing series to death. I think I read the Wraith Squadron book 4 times while waiting for my library to get the next one in for me. So yeah, definitely would have been Wedge growing up.
Nice.
Nowadays, I have to say it's probably a trifecta of Ahsoka, Rex, and Obi-Wan. Just watching the Star Wars again, it really seems to me like the story of Ahsoka and how she comes into herself as a Jedi. And even though, spoilers, she really comes into her own, that confidence, and is a really true embodiment of what I see a Jedi should be. And then Rex, because the Clone Wars is the story about the clones in many ways and their participation in that war. And then finally, we'll go to Obi-Wan, who I think is just, they really put him through the ringer if you think about it. Of what happens in the Clone Wars, what happens like before that, losing Qui-Gon, the things with Satine. And then through all that, he is still able to do what he does, but go into self-imposed isolation, everything to eventually coach Luke. Oh, and also he's just a badass, isn't he? I mean,
Definitely.
If you think about it, he is probably one of the most powerful Jedis. He defeats Maul multiple times, defeats Grievous, defeats Anakin at his peak. So I think his skills with the lightsaber are a bit underrated, to be honest.
Yeah, no, you're totally right that he is the master of lightsaber combat. Well, I did come up with one. What do you call the laser weapon of a Jakku scavenger?
What? Go ahead.
A ray gun.
I like it.
Nice.
All right. Well, if someone is interested in getting into your field or becoming a scientific mercenary, what would you recommend?
I think my specific company hires actually quite a lot of different scientists because we need that breadth of knowledge to be able to do what we do. So we have chemists, we have physicists, people who focus just on materials, optics, but also some biology, electronics engineers, mechanical engineers. So I think in general, STEM is a pretty good field to go into, computer science and the like as well. And that's something that we and a few, and there's a few science and technology consultancies. I think there's quite a few in the area where I happen to live in, but there's definitely a few in the US and Australia as well. Yeah, any of those things are things that will help open that door. You don't need to go and do grad studies, but just a general curiosity and wanting to discover how we can make something. Because similar to the discussions we're having here, a lot of it sometimes is, how would we do this thing? You know, we scientifically, we think it's possible. And what we do a lot of time is start to tackle those engineering questions that we waved aside a little bit. Scientifically, we think this is possible, but how would we do it? How would we actually make it?
Wow. So basically anyone in a STEM field can become a science mercenary or a STEM mercenary, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very cool.
Now I want a cool series about STEM mercs going around and sciencing things.
Yeah, that seems more like a Star Trek series, maybe. Star Trek comics. I would read it.
I mean, the real heroes of the Federation are the engineers, right? They solve pretty much all their problems.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Well, thank you very much, Karen, for coming out and geeking out with us today about so much things, just so much to think about and some really cool ideas.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. Oh, I didn't even get to talk about transparent chicken. Next time.
Wait, what?
Okay, we got to talk about transparent chicken. What is this?
All right. I think originally I was thinking about, transparent steel and how they could make transparent steel. But metals, just a matter of the fact that they're held by metallic bonding, have electron clouds, makes it very difficult. But you get ceramics that are transparent. But I think the other thing, while discussing it with my colleagues, because again, we're all scientists and nerds and we like to discuss these things. My colleague just mentioned that they read a paper just the other day about how to make chicken breasts transparent. No idea why they want to do this, but apparently by adding tartrazine, you can make chicken breasts transparent.
Wow.
So we might not get transparent metals for a while, but we could get transparent chicken breasts very soon.
That is disturbing on so many levels.
Yeah, wild. I mean, I know we're wrapping up or whatever, but for the transparent steel, is that something that shows up in Star Wars? Are there transparent metals?
Yeah, like the view screens or the windows on ships and stuff, they're transparent steel.
Okay,
Anytime
I
you
never
have
heard that term.
A window, yeah, it's in the EU came up with it as a way to not say glass.
Right. And I know we talked about it before not being view screens the way it is in a lot of Star Trek episodes, but being actually, windows. So interesting. Cool. Okay.
I am still very disturbed by the transparent chickens.
I like it though. If I can find a link to that paper, if it's open access or whatever, we'll include it in the show notes because I'm so curious.
I will find it for you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Karen. This was a lot of fun, and I'm glad we made time for transparent chicken.
Yeah, thanks for asking me again.
That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Karen Yu, and we want to thank all of you for listening.
Star Warsologies is going to be at Star Wars Celebration in April 2025 in Japan, so come see us. I will be helping Fawn Davis with a panel about miniatures in Star Wars.
And I have 2 panels at Star Wars Celebration Japan. The first one is Science of Revenge of the Sith. Well, we're looking at Revenge of the Sith for its 20th anniversary. Can you believe that? And also Droids, AI, and Sentience. So see you at Celebration Japan. If you're coming out, say hi.
Woo, Celebration! And if you're looking for the links we talked about, check out our show notes page available at skywalkingthroughneverland.com/star-warsologies. And also check out our YouTube channel where we post episodes and sometimes have related visuals from Star Wars.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Instagram and Blue Sky or at starwarsologies@gmail.com. We also have a fan group on Facebook. It's cleverly named the Star Warsologies Podcast Fan Group, so join, chat with us and your fellow listeners.
And please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service and share it with all of your lightsaber and pew-pew loving friends.
No topic is off limits, even how much goo can Grogu grow if Grogu could grow goo. For more hilarity, check out my book, Star Wars Crossword Puzzles and Other Word Games from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. It's out from Chronicle and is available at your local bookstore or online booksellers like Barnes & Noble, Bookshop.org, and Amazon.
Awesome. We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including the Max FX podcast, Neverland Clubhouse, and the flagship show, Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also a YouTube show called Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com. And join us next time on Star Warsologies, where we'll share our WonderCon panel, The Science of Disneyland. If you're coming to WonderCon in March 2025, come check that out.
Well, so this Kaizen, you said it's a sugar, so I should pour sugar and clams on my wounds.
Again, I am not a medical doctor. I am not endorsing this in any way.
All right.